The rain had been falling on Sycamore Lane since before dawn. The kind of slow, gray rain that doesn't announce itself with thunder or drama, but simply arrives and stays, soaking into everything it touches. By 7 in the morning, the gutters along the old block were running full, and the for lease signs on two of the storefronts near the corner had gone limp and translucent, the ink bleeding down through the cardboard in long, dark streaks. Inside Kowalski's corner market, the fluorescent light above the bread aisle had been flickering for 11 days. Daniel Kowalski knew this because he had started counting the days the same morning he'd received the first past due notice from the wholesale distributor. And now you're thinking somehow that fixing the light and fixing the invoice were problems of a similar size, and that he could solve them in a similar order. He had been wrong about that, as he had been wrong about several things in the 2 years since his father passed and left him the store. Daniel was 34 years old, though most people who came into the market on a regular basis assumed he was older. It was something about the way he moved through the narrow aisles, unhurried and deliberate, the way his hands knew where everything was without his eyes having to look. His father had moved the same way. 40 years of the same floor plan will do that to a person. The body memorizes what the mind no longer has to think about. He was behind the register at 7:30, tallying the previous day's receipts on a yellow legal pad the way his father had done before the first computer ever came into the store, when the bell above the door gave its familiar sound and Mrs. Petrakis came in out of the rain. She was 81 years old, had been shopping at Kowalski's since before Daniel was born, and she never came in before 9. He looked up. "Mrs. Petrakis, you're early." She shook the rain from her umbrella and propped it against the doorframe. "The pharmacist called. They're changing my prescription again." She said it the way she said most things, as though the news were mildly inconvenient, but fundamentally unsurprising, the way a woman of 81 has learned to receive most news. "I need to pick it up at 10. I thought I would come here first." Daniel set down his pencil. Sure, I'll put the coffee on." "You don't have to do that." "I know." He put the coffee on anyway, and Mrs. Petrakis settled onto the stool he kept near the end of the register counter, the one that had been there since his father put it there for Mrs. Petrakis's mother sometime in the late 1980s. And she pulled her change purse from her bag and set it on the counter the way she always did, though she would not be ready to shop for another 20 minutes. This was the rhythm of things. Daniel had grown up inside this rhythm the way other children grow up inside music. The morning moved the way Tuesday mornings in October moved on Sycamore Lane. Slow. The rain kept most people home, or rushed those who did come in through the door and back out again with their hoods up and their eyes down. Daniel worked the register and restocked the canned goods aisle and did the things that needed doing without speaking much, because the store had a specific quiet in the early hours that he had learned to respect. At 8:45, his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at it. His sister, Linda, calling from Portland. He let it go to voicemail. She would call again in the evening, and the conversation would be the same one they had been having for 4 months, which was the conversation about the offer from Meridian Properties and what Daniel intended to do about it. What Daniel intended to do about it was nothing. This was a position Linda found increasingly difficult to understand. The Meridian offer was, by every financial measurement Linda had applied to it, generous. It was also, by every measurement Daniel knew how to apply, but not the point. The store had been on Sycamore Lane for 51 years. His father had opened it at 26 with savings from 6 years of working double shifts at the packaging plant, a handshake lease on the building, and the absolute unshakable certainty that this block, these neighbors, these people needed a place where they knew the person behind the counter and the person behind the counter knew them. That was the entire business model. It had worked for 51 years. The fact that the block around it had changed, that 3 of the 4 storefronts visible from the front window were now either empty or occupied by businesses that had no idea who their customers were, did not change what the store was or what it was for. This was not a position Daniel had ever managed to fully explain to Linda, though he had tried several times. Linda was a financial analyst. She was also genuinely trying to help. The gap between those two things and the thing Daniel was trying to protect was simply too wide to bridge in a phone call, so he let her calls go to voicemail more and more, and told himself he would explain it properly when he had the right words, which he had not yet found. Mrs. Petrakis finished her coffee and made her way through the aisles. She bought the things she always bought, her movements through the store, as familiar to Daniel as the store's own floor plan. She paid in exact change, counted out carefully from the change purse, and Daniel bagged her groceries in the paper bags she preferred. At the door, she turned. The light in the bread aisle is flickering again. I know. I'm going to fix it this week. She looked at him for a moment over the tops of her bifocals. Not unkindly, the look of a woman who has known a person long enough to see when they are carrying something they are not saying. Your father, she said, never let a thing stay broken longer than it needed to. Daniel held the door for her. No, ma'am, he didn't. She went out into the rain. Daniel watched her until she reached the corner, umbrella up, change purse in her bag, the small dignified figure of a woman navigating an unchanged neighborhood with the confidence of someone who has been navigating it for 60 years. Then he let the door close and went back to the register. He looked at the yellow legal pad. The numbers were the same numbers they had been before Mrs. Petrakis arrived. They did not improve from being looked at. When he turned the pad face down on the counter, it was on a Thursday, 2 weeks later, that everything began. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The first cold front of the season had blown through overnight, dropping the temperature 15 degrees in the space of 6 hours and coating the streets with the kind of thin, colorless chill that made everything look like an old photograph. Sycamore Lane in the early morning of a cold Thursday had a particular quality to it. The way a place looks when the light hasn't fully committed yet and everything is still in the process of being decided. Daniel had been in since 5:30. There was a produce delivery on Thursdays, and he liked to be there early enough to go through the crates himself, pulling anything that wouldn't make it to the end of the week and setting it aside for the reduced rack near the door. His father had done it the same way. You didn't put something out that you wouldn't sell to someone you knew. And on Sycamore Lane, you knew everyone. He was in the back when he heard the bell above the door at the 7:12. He came out from the stockroom to find a man standing just inside the entrance, still holding the door handle as though he had not quite decided whether to let it go. He was old, somewhere in his mid-70s by the look of him, with white hair that the wind had disordered, and a coat that was good quality but had seen weather before. The kind of coat that had been bought to last and was accomplishing that. When he was thin in the way some older men are thin, not frail, not diminished, but refined, as though the years had stripped away everything that wasn't essential and left only the structure. What Daniel noticed first, because he was the kind of person who noticed shoes, was that the man's were good, dark leather, well-made, recently polished. The shoes of a man who attended to details. What he noticed second was that the man's hands were shaking just slightly, just enough to be visible if you were paying attention, and Daniel was always paying attention in his own store. Come in, Daniel said. You're letting the cold in. The man released the door handle. It swung shut behind him. He stood for a moment, looking around the store, and Daniel had the brief impression of someone taking inventory, or the quick calibrated look of a person who was accustomed to assessing spaces. Is it all right if I sit somewhere? The man said. His voice was steady, whatever the hands were doing. A voice that was accustomed to being listened to. Counter stool, Daniel said. Coffee's on. The man made his way to the stool at the end of the counter, the one Mrs. Petrakis occupied on her Tuesday visits, and sat down carefully. He unbuttoned his coat but did not take it off. His hands were still shaking. He pressed them flat against his knees. Daniel poured coffee into a mug and set it on the counter in front of him, then added the small ceramic pitcher of cream without being asked, because most people of that generation took cream, and Daniel had learned not to make people ask for ordinary things. The man looked at the coffee for a moment. Yummer, thank you. You passing through, or do you live nearby? A pause, something in the pause that Daniel noted without knowing yet what to do with it. Nearby, the man said, in a manner of speaking. Daniel went back to the produce crates. He didn't push. The store had a specific quality of not pushing that was either its most valuable characteristic or, depending on who you asked, one of the primary reasons it had not kept up with the times. Daniel considered it the same thing. He worked through the crates while the man sat at the counter and drank his coffee slowly, both hands wrapped around the mug now, the warmth of it steadying them. The store was quiet except for the sound of Daniel moving crates and the distant sound of a truck making its early rounds on the block. The fluorescent light in the bread aisle flickered twice. While at 7:45, a woman came in. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, expensively dressed, moving with the specific efficiency of someone who had more things to accomplish before 9 in the morning than most people accomplished in a full day. She picked up a basket at the door, moved through the aisles with her phone in one hand, barely glancing at the shelves, selecting items by memory or habit or some combination of the two. At the register, she set down the basket and looked at Daniel. "Is the Wi-Fi working? I need to send something urgent." "Store Wi-Fi is for customers." She gestured at the basket. "I am a customer." He gave her the password. She stood at the end of the counter, phone held up, angled toward the window for signal, and she did not look at the man sitting 2 feet away from her on the stool. Not once. Once Daniel noticed. He noticed the specific quality of that not looking, the practiced urban invisibility that people in a certain kind of hurry develop for anyone who does not directly require their attention. The old man on the stool looked at his coffee mug. The woman sent her email, paid for her groceries without looking up from her phone, and left. The bell above the door gave its sound. The old man's hands were wrapped around the mug again. "More coffee?" Daniel asked. "Please." He refilled the mug. The man looked at it. "My name is Edward," he said. "Edward Marsh." Daniel dried his hands on the dish towel and held one out across the counter. "Daniel Kowalski, this is my store." Edward Marsh shook it, a firm handshake, the kind that was automatic rather than performed, the grip of a man who had shaken a great many hands in a great many rooms, and no longer had to think about how. His hand was cold from the walk-in. "How long have you had it?" he said. "My family's had it 51 years. I've had it too." Edward looked around the store again with that same inventory quality, slower this time. His eyes moved over the shelves, the produce rack, the framed photographs above the register, the handwritten signs in the window advertising the week's specials in Daniel's father's handwriting, the originals laminated and preserved because Daniel hadn't yet been able to bring himself to replace them. "Your father's handwriting," Edward said. It wasn't a question. Daniel looked at the signs. "Yes." "When did he pass?" 2 years ago, March." Edward was quiet for a moment. He looked at the photographs. Daniel's father as a young man at the store's opening, standing in front of the new hand-painted sign in 1973. Daniel's father and mother at the counter in 1988, a Christmas Eve, judging by the decorations. Daniel's father at the register on his last day before the illness got too much, February 3 years ago, wearing the Kowalski's corner market apron that had been hanging on the hook in the back room since 1975. "He built something worth keeping," Edward said. Daniel looked at the photographs. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." The door opened again. 2 more customers, in and out quickly. A teenager from the high school 2 blocks over who bought a water and a granola bar and spent the entire transaction looking at her phone. An older man who bought cigarettes and spoke to Daniel in Polish, the way he had been speaking to the Kowalski family since the early 1980s, and who glanced at Edward on his stool with mild curiosity before heading back out. Edward Marsh sat through all of it, finishing his second cup of coffee, warming his hands, saying nothing unless Daniel spoke to him first. He had a quality that Daniel found unusual and could not immediately name, the quality of a man who was accustomed to being the center of a room, but had, for whatever reason, on this particular morning in this particular store, chosen not to be, as though he had set something down outside the door and come in without it. At 8:30, the produce delivery driver arrived for Daniel to sign off on the shortfall claim for 3 crates of damaged tomatoes. A bureaucratic process that required forms and time and the particular concentrated patience of a man who was trying to recover $14 from a company that processed 10,000 invoices a week. Daniel signed the forms and the driver left, and when Daniel turned back, Edward Marsh was standing at the end of the bread aisle, looking up at the flickering light. Ballast, Edward said. Daniel came down the aisle. I know, I keep meaning to replace it. The ballast goes before the bulb, usually. You can get a magnetic one at the hardware place on Fenwick. Older style, more reliable. He paused. If you have a ladder, I can take a look. Daniel regarded him for a moment. You know about fluorescent ballasts? I know about a great many things, Edward said. And there was something brief in his expression that might have been humor and might have been something older and more complicated. The ladder. Daniel brought the ladder from the stockroom. Edward climbed it with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood his limitations and worked within them rather than pretending they didn't exist, which was a kind of competence that Daniel respected. He opened the light fixture, looked at the ballast, confirmed his diagnosis, climbed back down. Magnetic ballast, T8 tube, he said. An hour's work if you have the right parts. I'll get them today. Edward stood at the bottom of the ladder, and whatever had been driving the shaking in his hands earlier seemed to have quieted. There was color in his face that hadn't been there when he walked in. He looked at the store around him, at the produce rack and the canned goods and the handwritten specials in the window, with an expression that Daniel would think about later. That night, going over the morning in the particular way he went over things he wasn't sure he understood yet. It was the expression of a man looking at something he had not seen in a long time. Not this store specifically, not these shelves or these signs, but the thing this store represented, the particular thing that a place becomes when it has been cared for, consistently by people who understand that caring for a place is the same thing as caring for the people inside it. Sit down again, Daniel said. I'll make fresh coffee. Edward sat. This is how it began, not with drama, not with a declaration or a crisis or a coincidence remarkable enough to announce itself as significant. Just a cold Thursday morning and a flickering light and a pot of coffee kept warm on a counter that had been kept warm for 51 years for anyone who needed it. Over the following 3 weeks, Edward Marsh became a regular. He came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, always between 7 and 8, always in the coat that was good but weathered, always sitting on the stool at the end of the counter. He drank 2 cups of coffee, black, and he paid for them, and for whatever small thing he bought, a newspaper, a tin of soup, a box of crackers, in exact cash, counted out carefully from a worn leather wallet. He never lingered past 9. He said where he was going, which was always walking, always in the direction of the park 2 blocks east. But he never said much about where he'd come from or who he was beyond what he'd offered that first morning. Edward Marsh, nearby, in a manner of speaking. Daniel did not push. He had spent his whole life in a store that survived on the principle of letting people be what they needed to be in it, and he extended the same courtesy to Edward that he extended to Mrs. Petrakis, to the Polish man with the cigarettes, to everyone who came through his door, the courtesy of being known without being interrogated. But he paid attention. He always paid attention. What he noticed, Edward's coat was the same coat every visit, but it was clean and pressed. The shaking in his hands had become less visible over the 3 weeks. Or perhaps Edward had simply learned which grip on the mug made it less apparent. He read the newspaper carefully, turned all the way through, the way people read newspapers who have opinions about things and are interested in whether the world is going in the right direction. He spoke about the city with the specific familiarity of someone who had been watching it for a long time, not as a resident watches a place, but as someone who has a larger perspective on it, some elevated vantage point from which the whole thing is visible. Once, in the second week, he said something about the Sycamore Lane development proposal that had been in the local paper. The old warehouse 3 blocks north was being considered for a mixed-use redevelopment, and the article had quoted several neighborhood residents who were divided about it. Development like that, Edward said, setting down the newspaper, is only as good as the intention behind it. You can build anything. What's harder is building something that knows what it's for. Daniel looked up from the invoices he was sorting. You sound like you've seen a few of them. A pause, the same kind of pause as the first morning. A few, Edward said. He finished his coffee, paid his 75 cents for the newspaper, and left. Daniel watched him go down the sidewalk in his good-weathered coat and thought, not for the first time, that there was more to Edward Marsh than a man who came in out of the cold twice a week and knew about fluorescent ballasts. He thought about asking. He thought about it again on Thursday and again the following Tuesday. He didn't ask. Something in him understood, in the way the store had always understood things about the people who came into it, that Edward Marsh was in the process of deciding something, and that the best thing Daniel could do was be exactly what this store had always been, a place where the deciding could happen at its own pace. It was in the fourth week that the envelope arrived. The return address was Meridian Properties, capital letters, professional typeface, the kind of stationery that communicated before you opened it that the contents were going to require a decision. Daniel set it on the counter next to his coffee and looked at it for a moment and then opened it with the small brass letter opener his father had kept in the register drawer. The letter was polite and direct. Meridian Properties was pleased to renew their interest in the Kowalski's corner market property at 114 Sycamore Lane. Given the development timeline for the adjacent parcels, they were prepared to increase their previous offer by 20%. This represented, the letter noted in the tone of people who are confident the math speaks for itself, a significant premium over assessed value. They hoped Daniel would reconsider their previous discussions. They had a revised contract ready to execute at his convenience. Daniel read it twice. He folded it and put it in the drawer under the counter, the same drawer where he kept the invoices and the spare receipt rolls and his father's original business license from 1973, now framed and covered in plastic wrap because it had been getting worn at the edges. He stood at the register for a long time. The fluorescent light in the bread aisle was working perfectly. He had replaced the ballast on a Friday afternoon, following Edward's diagnosis. He were 22 minutes from ladder up to ladder down. The light had been steady since. Something about its steadiness bothered him in a way he hadn't expected. The way a fixed thing sometimes makes you more aware of everything around it that is still broken. The door opened at 7:40. Edward Marsh, coat and paper, and the precise punctuality of a man who organized his days carefully. He sat on the stool. Daniel poured the coffee. "You look," Edward said, settling the newspaper on the counter, "like a man who has received news he already knew was coming." Daniel set the coffee pot back. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Meridian Properties," he said finally. Edward's hands were still on the counter. He looked at his coffee mug. "They want the building." "They've wanted it for a year," Daniel said. "And this time they raised the offer." "What are you going to do?" Daniel looked at the framed business license under its plastic wrap, at the photographs above the register, at the handwritten signs in the window with his father's lettering. "I don't know yet," he said. Edward was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the photographs. He looked for a brief and particular moment at his own hands on the counter, and something moved across his face that Daniel registered but couldn't read. "Your father built something worth keeping," Edward said again. The same words he had used 3 weeks ago, but the weight of them was different now, more deliberate, like a man choosing to say out loud a thing he has been thinking for some time. Daniel looked at him. "Kate, you said that the first morning." "I meant it then," Edward said. "I mean it now." A pause. "I think I mean it more now." He finished his coffee. He paid for the newspaper and the coffee, exact change, 75 and 40 combined. He put his wallet back in his coat pocket and buttoned the coat slowly, one button at a time, and for a moment he sat on the stool without moving, looking at the store, at all of it, with an expression that Daniel would spend a long time afterward trying to understand. "Same time Thursday?" Daniel said. Edward looked at him. Something in his eyes that was not the normal Tuesday morning thing, something that was a decision recently arrived at, or perhaps a decision long arrived at and finally acted upon. "Thursday," Edward said. "Yes." He walked out. The bell above the door gave its sound. Daniel stood at the counter for a long time after he left. He pulled the Meridian letter back out of the drawer and read it a third time. He put it back. He looked at the produce rack and the bread aisle with its steady light and the handwritten signs in the window and the photographs and the business license. He thought about what his father used to say on Thursday mornings when the store was quiet and the week had its own particular pace. The people who come in here, Danny. Those are the reasons. Everything else is just math. Daniel had been treating it as math for 2 years, trying to solve the equation, the offer against the debt, the premium against the overhead, the numbers that didn't improve from being looked at. He picked up his legal pad. He turned it over. He wrote at the top of a fresh page, not a number, but a question. What is this place actually for? He sat with the question for a long time. Outside on Sycamore Lane, the first real cold of November had settled in, and the for lease signs on the corner storefronts were still there in the gray morning light, and the development notices were still posted to the utility poles the way they had been since August. And the block looked the same way it had looked for 2 years, changed and unchanged simultaneously, the way places look when they are in the process of becoming something and haven't decided yet what. Inside the store, the fluorescent light in the bread aisle held steady. 3 Thursdays later, Edward didn't come in at his usual time. Daniel noticed at 8 when the stool was still empty. He noticed again at 8:30, in it when the door opened and closed twice, and neither time was Edward Marsh in his good-weathered coat. By 9, which was the absolute outer edge of Edward's Thursday window, Daniel had told himself several reasonable things. Edward had a doctor's appointment. The cold had kept him in. A Thursday was still a Thursday, and there was nothing to be alarmed about in a man of 70-some years, varying his routine by a morning. He told himself these things, and he restocked the canned goods aisle, and he processed the morning's receipts, and he thought, underneath all of it, that something felt different in the store than it had on any of the preceding Thursdays, which was a feeling he couldn't attach to a reason, but couldn't dismiss either. At 9:45, the door opened. Edward Marsh came in, and he was not wearing the weathered coat. And he was wearing a dark suit that had been tailored within the last year, conservatively cut, the kind of suit that was not intended to impress, but simply to reflect accurately the standing of the person wearing it. His hair was combed. He was carrying a leather portfolio. He sat on the stool. He looked at Daniel. Daniel set down the stock pen he was holding and looked back. "I owe you some honesty," Edward said. Daniel did not say anything immediately. He set the stock pen down on the counter with the careful deliberateness of a man who understands that the next few minutes are going to require his full attention and is making room for them. He looked at Edward Marsh in his tailored suit with his leather portfolio on the counter between them, and he thought about all the Tuesdays and Thursdays, all the cups of coffee, all the things Edward had said in the specific way he had said them, and he thought about the pauses, the ones that had weight to them, and he thought that on some level he had known, or suspected, or been carefully not asking himself a question he already sensed the answer to. "All right," Daniel said. Edward placed both hands flat on the portfolio, not opening it, just acknowledging that it existed and that what was in it was part of what he owed. "My name is Edward Marsh," he said. That part was true. Daniel waited. "I am the founder and majority shareholder of Marsh Capital Group." A pause. "Among other things, Marsh Capital holds a controlling interest in Meridian Properties." The store was very quiet. Outside, a delivery truck moved slowly down Sycamore Lane, and for a moment its engine was the only sound in the world. Daniel looked at the counter, at the drawer where the Meridian letter was folded under the invoices and the business license, at the photographs of his father above the register. He looked at all of these things in the order they presented themselves to him, and he did not say anything yet, because he had learned in 2 years of running this store alone that the first thing you said when you were hit with something unexpected was rarely the right thing, and that waiting a moment cost nothing. Edward was watching him, not with the expression of a man bracing for a reaction, but with the expression of a man who has decided to be honest and is prepared to receive whatever honesty earns him, which is a different thing entirely. "The offer," Daniel said finally. "The letters. Of Meridian Properties." "Yes." "That was your company." "Yes." Daniel pressed his hands flat on the counter, the way Edward's were flat on the portfolio, and looked at the older man directly. "Then what were you doing on a stool in my store for 4 weeks drinking my coffee?" Edward looked at his hands, then he looked up. "I came to look at what I was buying," he said. That is what I told myself when I first walked through your door on a Thursday morning 3 weeks and 4 days ago. He paused. I came to assess the property in person. I have done it before with acquisitions that seem straightforward on paper, but that I wanted to understand from the ground up. You learn different things standing inside a place than you learn from a site report. And what did you learn? Daniel said. His voice was even. Whatever he was feeling was behind it, not in it, which was something his father had modeled and Daniel had learned without knowing he was learning it. Edward was quiet for a moment. That I had been doing the math wrong, he said. He opened the portfolio then. He took out a single document and set it on the counter between them. Not the Meridian contract, something else. Daniel looked at it without picking it up. I want to tell you something first, Edward said. Before you look at that, I want to tell you why I kept coming back. Daniel left the document on the counter. Go ahead. This is what Edward Marsh told him on a Thursday morning in November, sitting on a stool at a counter that had been there for 51 years, with a cup of coffee he had paid for in exact change. He had come in the first Thursday intending to spend 40 minutes, to walk the floor, assess the space, confirm what the site reports had told him, drink a cup of coffee, and leave. He had done this kind of thing before, and it had always taken 40 minutes or less, because the things he was looking for were physical things, structural things, things that existed in square footage and sight lines and load-bearing walls. He had not been looking for a man who poured cream into his coffee without being asked. It was such a small thing. Edward knew that. He had spent 50 years in rooms where small things were noted and cataloged and deployed strategically, and he recognized a small thing when he encountered one. But there was something about the specific quality of Daniel's attention that morning. The way he had looked up from the register, the way he had held the door open without ceremony, the way the coffee appeared without fanfare and the cream appeared without asking, as though the person behind the counter had looked at Edward Marsh at 7 in the morning and understood, without needing it explained, that he was cold and tired and needed something warm, and that was enough information to act on. Edward had not been looked at that way in a long time. He was not sure he had ever been looked at that way. He had come back Tuesday because he told himself he needed to look at the eastern wall more carefully for a structural assessment. He had brought the newspaper. He had sat on the stool again. He had noticed on the second visit the photographs above the register, and on the third the handwritten signs in the window. And by the fourth he had stopped pretending that he was there for structural reasons. I have been in business for 50 years, Edward said. He was looking at the counter, not at Daniel, the way people look when they are telling the true version of something and need to focus inward to get it right. I built Marsh Capital from a single acquisition in 1974, a struggling textile factory outside Cleveland that everyone else had written off. I turned it around in 3 years. I acquired 11 more companies in the next decade. By 1990, I was being called a visionary. He said the last word with a flatness that contained its own commentary. The covers of magazines, Senate testimony, my photograph in lobbies. He was quiet for a moment. My wife, Caroline, died 8 years ago. We had been married 41 years. And I have 2 sons and a daughter. They are all in their various ways successful. I have 9 grandchildren. I know their names and their birthdays. I do not know with any real confidence what they are afraid of, what they dream about, or what they need from me beyond the trust funds I have established for their educations. Daniel said nothing. He listened the way the store had always enabled listening. I have been conducting my life, Edward said, for a long time, from an altitude where individual people are difficult to see. I have been good at this. I have been, by most measurements, exceptional at this. What I have not been good at is the thing your father was good at, which is the thing this store is built on. He looked up then, knowing who's in the room. The store was quiet between them. When you looked at me that first morning, Edward said, and poured the cream before I asked for it, I thought about something my wife used to say. She used to say I had learned to see the world from so high up that the people in it had stopped looking like people. She said it kindly. She was that kind of woman. But she meant it, and she was right, and she said it several times in the last 10 years of her life, and I received it each time as a statement I agreed with in principle and intended to act on later. He paused. I kept finding reasons to act on it later. He looked at the portfolio. I am 76 years old. I have stage 2 kidney disease. My cardiologist tells me I'm doing well, relative to what doing well means for a 76-year-old man with my history. But I am not going to live forever, which is a thing I have understood intellectually for some time, and which I have recently begun to understand in my body, which is a different kind of understanding entirely. Daniel looked at him, at the man behind the suit, behind the portfolio, behind 50 years of altitude, the same man who had climbed his ladder on a Tuesday morning and diagnosed his ballast and come back down carefully. Why are you telling me this? Daniel said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. Because you deserve to know who has been sitting on your stool, Edward said, and because what I have to say next is going to require that you have the full picture, not just the part that reflects well on me. He slid the document across the counter. Daniel picked it up. It was not the Meridian acquisition contract. It was a 2-page summary. A letterhead he did not recognize, not Meridian, not Marsh Capital, something else. He read the first paragraph. He read it again. He set the document down. This is a community development proposal, Daniel said. Yes, for Sycamore Lane. Yes, with the store as the anchor tenant. Daniel looked at him. Protected, guaranteed lease, 20 years, below market rate, locked. Yes, and the development around it designed to serve the existing neighborhood rather than replace it. That is the intent, yes. Daniel looked at the document again, at the second page which outlined the financing structure, at the name of the foundation that was providing the initial capital, the Caroline Marsh Community Foundation. He looked up. Edward said, why, she would have walked through your door that first Thursday and known immediately what it was and why it mattered. She would not have needed 4 weeks. Something moved across his face, brief and specific and more honest than anything he had said yet. I needed 4 weeks. I am not, despite what 50 years of boardrooms has suggested, a fast learner about the things that matter. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Daniel sat down on the stool on his side of the counter, the one he kept behind the register for long afternoons. He looked at the document and then at Edward Marsh and then at the photographs of his father and then at the document again. The Meridian offer, he said. The letters, the pressure. Was real, Edward said. I won't pretend otherwise. The acquisition team operates independently within the parameters I set. I set those parameters in the spring before I came here, before I walked through your door. He held Daniel's gaze. What I did not know in the spring, when I set those parameters from an altitude where Sycamore Lane was a coordinate on a site map, was what this store was. I know now. What is it? Daniel said. He wasn't testing Edward. He wanted to hear him say it. Edward looked around the store. At the produce rack in the bread aisle with its steady light and the handwritten signs in the window. At the stool he had been sitting on for 4 weeks. At the drawer under the register where 51 years of business licenses and letters lived side by side. It's the reason, Edward said, for all the rest of it. The neighborhood, the block, the people who have somewhere to go where somebody knows them. Your father understood that. He built it into every part of this place. A pause. I have spent my career building things that replace that. I would like, before I am finished, to build something that protects it instead. The silence between them had a different quality now. Not the silence of a confrontation, and not the silence of an ending. The silence of 2 men sitting with something that was larger than either of them and trying to figure out what to do with it honestly. I have questions, Daniel said. I expect you do. A lot of them. I have time, Edward said, for he looked at his coffee mug, which was empty. If you have more coffee. Daniel got up and poured it. They talked for 2.5 hours. Daniel asked every question he had, and there were many because Daniel Kowalski was his father's son, and his father had never signed anything he didn't understand and had never understood anything he hadn't asked about directly. He asked about the financing structure, and the lease terms, and the community oversight board, and what happened to the proposal if Edward's health changed and who controlled the foundation, and what the development timeline looked like, and who the other tenants would be, and what the criteria were for selecting them. Edward answered every question. Some answers were complete, some were incomplete, and Edward said so, showing identifying the gaps clearly and explaining why they existed and what would be needed to fill them. There was nothing evasive in any of it. The answers had the quality of a man who has spent 50 years in rooms where questions were asked strategically and has decided, for reasons that had been 4 weeks in the making, to answer them differently. At one point, around the middle of the second hour, a woman came in with 2 small children and spent 15 minutes in the cereal aisle. Daniel excused himself, helped her find what she needed, rang her up, gave the smaller of the 2 children a small apple from the produce rack-reduced basket while her mother wasn't looking. He came back to the counter and picked up the conversation where he had left it. Edward had watched the whole exchange without comment. When Daniel sat back down, something had settled further in Edward's expression. "Your father did that," Edward said. "The apple." Daniel looked at the produce rack. "He did. I watched him once," Edward said. "A long time ago. I didn't realize until just now that I was watching him." Daniel looked at him carefully. "You've been to this store before?" "Once," Edward said. 1991. We were looking at a property on the north end of the block. I walked the whole street. I came in here for a bottle of water." He looked at the counter. "Your father was behind the register. He gave me the water, and 30 seconds later, a woman came in with a boy who was crying about something, and your father came around the counter and crouched down to the boy's level and talked to him for a minute until the boy stopped crying. He did it so naturally that by the time he was back behind the register, it felt like it had been part of the transaction." He paused. "We didn't acquire the North End property. I have thought about that coincidence several times in the last 4 weeks." Daniel said nothing. He looked at the photographs above the register. At his father in 1988. At his father on his last day. "He was the same every day," Daniel said. "For as long as I can remember. He didn't have 2 versions." "No," Edward said. "I could see that from one visit." He looked at his hands on the counter. "I have had 2 versions for most of my professional life. The version that built things and the version that existed in the spaces between the building. Caroline used to say the second version was the real one. She said the first version was just what the real one wore to work." He paused. "She was right about that too." By the time they finished talking, the morning had moved into early afternoon, and the store had been through its quiet lunch hour traffic. A handful of regulars and 2 people who had never been in before and would probably not come back. The normal daily mix. Mrs. Petrakis had not come in, which was unusual for a Thursday, and Daniel made a mental note to check on her. The documents sat on the counter between them. The proposal, the numbers, the 20-year lease, the Edward Marsh Community Foundation, the future of 114 Sycamore Lane, presented in 2 pages of careful language. "I'm not going to decide today," Daniel said. "I'm not asking you to," Edward said immediately. "Which I am asking you to take it to whoever helps you think through decisions. A lawyer, a friend, someone whose judgment you trust." He paused. "I am asking you to ask the hard questions of it and bring them back to me. And if the hard questions don't have good answers, then we'll know that," Edward said, "and we'll deal with it accordingly." He picked up his portfolio. "I did not come back today to close a deal. I came back to tell you the truth, because you have been honest with me for 4 weeks without asking for anything in return, and that deserved better than what you were getting." He stood up. He buttoned his coat, the good coat, the one that had preceded the suit by 3 weeks, and he picked up the portfolio. And he looked at Daniel with the specific expression of a man who has set something down that he had been carrying wrong for a long time. "Thursday?" Daniel said. Edward looked at him, a brief moment of something that in a different kind of man might have been relief. "Thursday," he said. "Yes, regular time." He walked out. The bell above the door gave its sound. Daniel sat at the counter alone with the proposal in front of him, and the drawer full of letters beneath him, and the photographs above him, and the bread aisle holding its steady light down the length of the store. He sat with all of it for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called Linda. She answered on the second ring with the particular alertness of someone who has been waiting for a call that was overdue. "Danny, I need to talk to you about the store," he said. On a pause. "Okay." He could hear her adjusting, settling in, shifting from the financial analyst register to the sister register, the one she reserved for conversations that required both. "Not the Meridian offer," he said. "Something different." He told her everything. He started with the first Thursday morning and the man who came in out of the cold and sat on the stool, and he went through the 4 weeks and the coffee and the ballast and the newspaper and the development comments. And he told her about the suit and the portfolio and the name and the foundation and the proposal. All of it in the order it had happened, the way his father had always told stories, the way that respected the shape of a thing by not jumping ahead to the ending. Linda listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Linda, but she had learned, somewhere in the last 2 years of watching her brother carry their father's store alone, that there were conversations that needed to be received before they could be responded to. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He owns Meridian," she said. "His company has a controlling interest, yes. And he came in and sat on the stool for 4 weeks. Every Tuesday and Thursday." Another pause. "Danny, that is either the most extraordinary thing I have heard in a year, or the most sophisticated piece of manipulation I have ever encountered in a business context." "I know," Daniel said. "Which do you think it is?" Daniel looked at the proposal on the counter, at the name of the foundation, at the 20-year lease, at the 2.5 hours of questions answered without evasion. "I think," he said slowly, "that it's both, and that the second part stopped being true somewhere around the second week." Linda was quiet again. He could hear her thinking in the particular way she thought when she was working through something that didn't fit cleanly into a category. "Send me the proposal," she said finally. "All of it. I'll look at it tonight." "I need you to look at it as my sister first," Daniel said, "and then as a financial analyst." "Those aren't always different," Linda said, but her voice was different when she said it, softer. "Tonight they need to be." "All right," she said. "Send it." He photographed the document and sent it. He put the phone down and looked around the store in the late afternoon quiet. The specific quality of the store at 3 o'clock when the lunch traffic had thinned and the after-school rush hadn't started yet. And the pause in the middle of the day that his father had always used for the small tasks that didn't fit anywhere else. He got up and replaced the bulb in the dairy case that had been slightly dim for 2 weeks. He reorganized the top shelf of the canned goods aisle, which had gotten out of alignment during a busy Saturday. He swept the aisle near the door, where the cold weather was tracking in grit from the sidewalk. He did these things the way his father had done them, methodically and without drama. And while he did them, he thought about Edward Marsh on a stool in 1991, watching his father crouch down to talk to a crying boy, and then Edward Marsh on the same stool 33 years later, watching Daniel give an apple to a small child. And he thought about what it meant that those two moments were connected across a generation by the same counter in the same store, and whether that connection was coincidence or whether it was something that a 51-year-old business built on knowing who was in the room had simply been accumulating all along. He didn't know the answer. He thought his father might have known. He thought for the first time in 2 years that not knowing yet was all right, that the not knowing was its own kind of information. At 4:30, Marcus Webb came in. Marcus was 17, lived in the apartment building 2 blocks west, and had been coming into Kowalski's since he was 9 years old. He was in his junior year now, applying to colleges, working part-time at the dry cleaner on Fenwick on weekends. He came in 2 or 3 times a week for a snack and usually stayed for 10 minutes talking about whatever he was working on, because at some point in the last 2 years, the store had become the kind of place Marcus came to think out loud, and Daniel had become, without either of them naming it, the kind of person he thought out loud too. "My English essay is due Friday, and I have nothing," Marcus said, dropping his bag near the counter with the theatrical despair of someone who has been carrying the weight of this fact for several days. "What's the prompt?" "Write about a place that shaped who you are." He looked around the store. I was going to write about the basketball court on Arbor, but it flooded last spring, and now it's a construction site. He said this with the specific grief of someone whose mental geography has been altered by forces outside their control. Daniel thought about this. He thought about a document on the counter and a man in a tailored suit and a 20-year lease and a foundation named for a woman who had told her husband he had lost the ability to see people. Right about here, Daniel said. Marcus looked at him. The store? Tell me one thing this store has been for you. Marcus considered this with the focused attention he brought to things when he decided they were worth it. He looked at the counter, at the reduced rack near the door, at the photographs above the register. When my dad left, Marcus said slowly, anyway, the summer before 8th grade, my mom was bad for a while. There were nights she didn't cook. I used to come in here and you'd find something for me to do in the back, stocking or whatever, and then you'd send me home with whatever was on the reduced rack. He paused. You never said it was charity. You just acted like it was normal. Daniel said nothing. My mom never knew, Marcus said. I never told her. He looked at the register. I just knew that if things got bad enough, I could come here, and it would be okay. Daniel looked at the photographs of his father. He thought about Mrs. Petrakis's mother on a stool in the late 1980s. He thought about the Polish man who spoke only Polish and whose name Daniel knew and whose cigarette brand he kept in stock without being asked. Why, he thought about every person who had come through this door in 51 years and found, without it being announced or advertised or quantified, that someone behind the counter knew them well enough to give them what they needed. He thought about what his father used to say. The people who come in here, Danny, those are the reasons. Everything else is just math. Write about here, he said again. Write all of it. Marcus looked at him for a moment and then pulled out his notebook and sat at the end of the counter and started writing by hand, the way he sometimes did when he was working through something and typing felt too fast. And Daniel went back to his closing tasks, and the store held them both in its quiet, the way it had held people for 51 years. That evening, Linda called back. The proposal is legitimate, she said. Don, I ran the foundation, I checked the financing structure, I looked at the Caroline Marsh Community Foundation's filing history. It's real. It's been operating for 6 years, primarily in preservation and community development. The lease terms are favorable. The oversight structure has real teeth. A pause. The 20-year rate is below anything you'd find on the market. Significantly below. Is it too good? Daniel said. That was my first question, Linda said. I don't think so. I think it's calibrated to make the math work for you without being insulting. Whoever structured this understood what you need and did the math backward from there. Another pause. Wait, it's the kind of financial structure someone who has been doing this for 50 years would put together if they were trying to make it right, rather than make it profitable. Daniel sat in the back room of the store after closing, the same chair his father had used for the same purpose, going over the same kind of numbers under the same overhead light. What do you think? He said. Linda was quiet for a moment. I think Dad would have sat with it for a week and asked every question twice, she said. I think he would have wanted to know who Edward Marsh actually is as a person before he trusted the paper. A pause, shorter this time. I think you've already done that part. Daniel looked at the chair across the back room, the extra one, the one that had always been there for whoever came back to talk over the day's business. He thought about a man who climbed a ladder to look at a ballast and came back down carefully. He thought about a woman named Caroline who had told her husband he had lost the ability to see people and had named a foundation after herself that was now trying to do what she had asked him to do. Yeah, he said, I think I have. Then I think, Linda said, and her voice was the sister voice now, fully, that Dad built something worth keeping and that you have kept it and that the right person finally walked through the door. A pause. I also think you should have a lawyer review the contract before you sign anything. Obviously, Daniel said, I'm just saying. I know you're just saying. A brief silence between them, the companionable kind. Danny, Linda said. Yeah. He came in every Tuesday and Thursday for 4 weeks. Yes. And you just gave him coffee and let him sit. That's what the stool is for. Linda was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had something in it that Daniel had not heard in a long time. Maybe 2 years. Maybe longer. Dad would have done the same thing, she said. Daniel looked at the photographs of his father through the open door to the front of the store, at the handwritten signs in the window, at the bread aisle with its steady light. I know, he said. The following week moved with the particular quality of a week in which something large has been set in motion, and the motion has not yet become visible, but can be felt, the way a change in weather is felt before it arrives, in the pressure of the air and the particular way the light falls. Daniel met with a lawyer on Monday. She was thorough and direct and found 3 clauses she wanted modified and 2 protections she wanted added and 1 definition she considered dangerously vague. And Daniel brought her notes back to Edward on Thursday morning, and Edward read them at the counter with his coffee and said that 2 of the 3 modifications were reasonable and 1 was not necessary, but he understood why the lawyer had flagged it, and he was willing to amend it if it would provide Daniel with greater confidence in the structure. This was also how his father had done business, not with a handshake and a hope, but with the understanding that a fair agreement was one both parties had examined carefully, that the examination was not a sign of distrust, but of respect for what was being agreed to. They met twice more that week, not at the counter, but at the back table, with the documents spread out between them and Daniel's notes alongside them, and the coffee keeping warm on the burner. Mrs. Petrakis came in on one of the afternoons and sat on her stool and watched the 2 men at the back table with an expression that was not quite a smile and was not quite not a smile, and she drank her coffee and did not comment, which was its own kind of comment. On the last Thursday of November, Daniel Kowalski signed the agreement. He signed it at the counter, with his father's pen, the heavy brass one that had lived in the register drawer since 1975, the one his father had used for every important document the store had ever been party to. He signed his name in full, the way his father had signed things, unhurried, each letter complete. Edward Marsh witnessed it. He signed his own name beside Daniel's, and then he sat for a moment looking at the document, and Daniel looked at him, looking at it, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing useful to add to what had just happened. Then Daniel poured 2 cups of coffee and put the cream pitcher between them, and they sat at the counter, both on the same side of it for the first time, looking out at the store. The fluorescent light in the bread aisle held steady. I want to ask you something, Daniel said. Ask. The first morning, when you came in, your hands were shaking. Edward looked at his hands on the counter. They were steady now, the steadiness of a man who had been coming somewhere warm twice a week for over a month. I had just come from my cardiologist, Edward said. He had reviewed my latest results and told me that if I did not make some significant changes to the pace of my life, I was going to run out of it faster than I had planned. He paused. I had been sitting in my car outside his office for 20 minutes before I drove to Sycamore Lane. I came in here because there was a light on. Daniel looked at the front window, at the warm light of the store against the November morning. That's why people come in, Daniel said. Mostly, there's a light on. Edward looked at the window, at the handwritten special sign in his father's lettering. Your father knew that, he said. He did, Daniel said. He left it on for anyone. Outside on Sycamore Lane, the late November cold had settled in fully, the kind that made the street look clean and still. If in end, the 4 lease signs on the corner storefronts shifted in a thin wind, and the development notices on the utility poles had been joined by new ones in the last week. And the block was in the process of becoming what it was going to become, the same way it had been in that process for 2 years, the same way the whole city was always in that process. But inside Kowalski's corner market, the light was on, the same light it had always been. December moved through Sycamore Lane, the way December moves through old neighborhoods with a particular mix of noise and quiet, the noise of the holidays and the quiet of the cold, the 2 things existing alongside each other in the specific way they do on blocks where people have been living and shopping and knowing each other for a long time. Or Daniel had not announced what was happening with the store. It wasn't a secret, but it also wasn't his to announce yet, because the real shape of it was still becoming visible, and he had learned from his father that you didn't describe a thing until you could see its edges clearly. What people noticed, without knowing why, was that the store felt different. Not changed exactly. More itself, perhaps, the way something feels when it has been uncertain for a while and then finds its footing. Mrs. Petrakis noticed first, the way she noticed most things. She came in on a Tuesday in the second week of December and settled on her stool and looked at Daniel for a long moment before she said anything. "Something's different," she said. "The dairy case light is fixed," Daniel said. She looked at him over her bifocals. "Sorry, that is not what I mean." Daniel poured her coffee. He thought about his father, about a man in a tailored suit and a leather portfolio, about a document signed with a brass pen that had been in the register drawer since 1975, about a foundation named for a woman who had been right about everything. "The store's going to be here," he said, "for a long time." Mrs. Petrakis looked at him. Something in her face shifted, the small, particular adjustment of a person receiving news they had been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "Good," she said. "The way you say something when you mean all of it." Edward came in that same Tuesday, later than usual, just before 9. He sat on the stool and accepted the coffee and looked around the store with the expression he had developed over the last weeks. Not the inventory expression from the first morning, not the altitude expression, but something closer to the ground. Something that was learning to see what was actually there. "How is Marcus's essay coming?" he asked. Daniel looked at him. Edward had been in the store on the afternoon Marcus had been writing at the counter, though he had not been introduced and the conversation had been at a distance. "He turned it in last week," Daniel said. "Got a 94. Edward nodded. He drank his coffee. He looked at the photographs above the register. "Your father," he said, "would he have signed the agreement?" Daniel thought about this honestly, the way his father would have wanted him to. "When he would have asked more questions than I did," he said. "He would have made you come back more times." A pause. "But yes, he would have signed it, because he always said the best thing you could do for a place was make sure it was still there tomorrow." Edward looked at his coffee. "He sounds like a man I would have liked to know." "You met him in 1991, Daniel said. 30 seconds at the register." 30 seconds was enough to know something, Edward said. They sat in the quiet of a Tuesday morning in December, two men on stools at a counter that had been there for 51 years, with the coffee warm and the bread aisle steady and the light on in the window. Outside, the first real snow of the season was beginning to fall on Sycamore Lane, slow and without drama, the kind that simply arrives and covers everything quietly, already making the whole block look, for a brief hour, the way it had always looked before everything started changing. The construction began in February, not demolition. That was the first thing people on Sycamore Lane noticed, the ones who had been watching the development notices on the utility poles and bracing for the particular sound of things being taken apart. The crews that arrived on the first Monday of February were not demolition crews. They were restoration crews. And there is a difference that anyone who has lived on a changing block for long enough can hear in the way the equipment moves and the way the workers talk to each other and the specific quality of attention they bring to the buildings they are touching. Word moved through the block the way word moves in places where people still know their neighbors. Mrs. Petrakis told the Polish man with the cigarettes, who told the woman who ran the alteration shop on the corner before it closed, who told her daughter, who told 3 other people by noon. By the end of the first week, everyone who had been coming into Kowalski's corner market for longer than a year had asked Daniel some version of the same question, and Daniel had answered it the same way each time. Not with the full story, not yet, but with the part that mattered most to them right now. "The store's staying," he said. "The block is changing, but the store's staying." This was enough for the moment for most of them. The rest of it would become visible in time. The shape of a thing shows itself as it is built, not before. Edward Marsh came in on Tuesdays and Thursdays. This did not change. He still sat on the stool, ours still drank 2 cups of coffee, still paid an exact change from the worn leather wallet, still read the newspaper all the way through. What change was smaller and more significant than the routine? He asked about people by name now. He remembered that Mrs. Petrakis took her coffee without sugar, and that Marcus was waiting on a letter from his first-choice school, and that the dairy distributor had been shorting Daniel's orders by roughly 8% for the past 6 weeks, a pattern Daniel had noticed but not yet addressed, and which Edward had quietly looked into through channels Daniel did not ask about and confirmed was a systemic billing error that the distributor's accounts team corrected within 10 days of being contacted. He did not announce that he had done this. Daniel found out from the distributor's regional manager, who called to apologize and to offer a credit on the next 4 orders. Daniel looked at the phone after the call ended and thought about a man who had spent 50 years doing large things from a great height and was now doing small things from a stool. And he thought that the small things had the same hands behind them, and that perhaps that had always been true, and the height had simply made them invisible. He did not say any of this to Edward. He said, "The distributor called." Edward looked at his newspaper. Good. That was enough. In March, Marcus Webb received his acceptance letter. He came into the store on a Thursday afternoon, the letter in his hand, and he stood in the doorway for a moment with the expression of someone who has been hoping for something so specifically and for so long that the arrival of it hasn't fully registered as real. Daniel was behind the register. Edward was on the stool with his newspaper. Marcus held up the letter. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Daniel came around the counter. He shook Marcus's hand, firm, the way you shake the hand of someone who has earned something, not the way you shake the hand of someone you are congratulating for luck. Marcus stood straighter when Daniel shook his hand. Something settled in him that had been waiting to settle. Edward set down his newspaper. He looked at the boy in the doorway with his letter. He looked at him the way a man looks at something when he is fully present in the room, even when the altitude is gone and the ground is close, and what he sees is a person and not a coordinate. "Well done," Edward said. Marcus looked at him, at this older man in his good coat on the counter stool, and nodded with the instinctive courtesy of a kid who had been raised to acknowledge a thing when it was offered sincerely. "Thank you, sir." He did not know who Edward Marsh was. He did not need to. The sincerity was the point. Edward picked his newspaper back up, but he was not reading it. He was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man doing a kind of accounting, the kind that does not involve numbers, that involves instead the specific measurement of what a life has been spent on and what it has produced and what the difference is between those two things. Later, after Marcus had gone, Edward said, without looking up from the newspaper he was pretending to read, "Does he know what this store gave him?" "He knows," Daniel said. "He told me once. He didn't make a big thing of it." "No," Edward said. "That kind of knowing doesn't need to be a big thing. It just needs to be true." He turned a page of the newspaper. "I have been thinking about my grandchildren," he said. 9 of them. I know their names and their birthdays." He paused. "I called my oldest grandson last week. He is 14. I asked him what he was afraid of." Daniel looked at him. "What did he say?" "He was quiet for a long time," Edward said. Then he said, "that I'll end up in a job I hate because everyone expects it." A pause. He has never said that to anyone before. His mother told me afterward that she had not known he felt that way. Edward set the newspaper down. "I was on the phone with him for 40 minutes. We talked about what he actually wanted, what he was interested in outside of what was expected." He looked at the register. "It was the best conversation I have had in 8 years." Daniel looked at the photographs of his father. "What did Caroline used to say about your grandchildren?" Edward was quiet for a moment. "She said they were the second chance that came after the first chance, and that most men wasted both." He looked at the counter. "She was harder on me than anyone else in my life. She was the only person whose hardness I trusted completely because it came from the same place as everything else she did." He paused. "Love," he applied without softening. Daniel thought about his father, about the specific way he had been hard on Daniel, about the things that mattered, and entirely soft about the things that didn't, the particular skill of knowing which was which. "She would have liked this store," Daniel said. "She would have loved this store," Edward said. "She would have come in twice a week and known everyone's name within a month." Something in his face that was grief and pride simultaneously. the specific expression of a person describing someone they are no longer able to show things to. She would have told me I should have found it 20 years ago. She would have been right, Daniel said. She always was, Edward said. The snow that had fallen in December had long since gone, and in April brought the particular quality of light that came to Sycamore Lane in the spring, lower and warmer than the winter light, landing differently on the storefronts and the sidewalk and the front window of the store. The construction on the block had progressed steadily through the winter months, and the shape of what was being built was becoming visible now, the way Edward had said it would, the way things showed themselves as they were built rather than before. The building 2 doors north had been restored rather than replaced, its original facade cleaned and repaired. The ground floor redesigned for a small pharmacy that had agreed to anchor rates in a community lease structure similar to the stores. The empty lot on the corner, which had been a parking lot for 11 years, was being converted to a small public plaza, benches and trees and a covered area for the farmers market that the Community Development Board had been trying to establish on a Sycamore Lane for 3 years without the right space to put it. Mrs. Petrakis came in on a Tuesday morning in April and stood at the front window for a long moment looking at the construction, at the plaza taking shape on the corner, at the restored facade 2 doors north, at the specific and careful quality of what was being built around the store she had been coming to since before Daniel was born. "Your father," she said finally, "always said this block had good bones." "He did," Daniel said. "He was right." She came to the counter and sat on her stool. "He usually was." Daniel poured her coffee. He thought about bones, about what it meant for a place to have them, and the kind of structure that held up over 50 years, through every change of the block around it, because it was built on something real. His father had known what that something was. Daniel had been learning it for 2 years, and he thought he was beginning to understand it, not completely but clearly enough to act on. Edward arrived at 7:30 that Tuesday, later than usual, and when he came through the door, he was not alone. The young man with him was perhaps 30, with Edward's jaw and a more open version of Edward's eyes, wearing a jacket that was good but not formal, the jacket of someone who dressed for himself rather than for a room. He came in slightly behind Edward, looking around the store with a quality of attention that was familiar to Daniel in a way he couldn't immediately place. Then he placed it. It was the inventory look, Edward's look from the first morning. Except on this younger face, it was warmer, less practiced, more curious. "Daniel," Edward said, "this is my son James." James Marsh extended his hand, a firm handshake, direct eye contact, the natural ease of someone who had been taught how to enter a room and had then spent enough time in enough different kinds of rooms to do it without thinking. "My father," James said, "has told me a great deal about this store." "Sit down," Daniel said. "Coffee's on." He poured 3 cups. They sat at the counter, all 3 of them, and the morning moved around them the way mornings did on Sycamore Lane, the regulars coming in and out, the particular rhythm of a Tuesday in April, and they talked. James had come from Boston, where he ran the operational side of Marsh Capital's Community Development Division, the division that was managing the Sycamore Lane project, among others. He had not been told until 2 weeks ago the full story of how the Sycamore Lane agreement had come about. Edward had told him on a Sunday evening, the whole account, starting from the cardiologist and the 20 minutes in the car and the cold Thursday morning and the flickering light in the bread aisle. James had listened to the whole thing. Then he had said, "I want to meet him." "Why?" Edward had asked. "Because," James said, "you are different since you started coming here, and I want to understand what that looks like from the other side." Edward had told Daniel this at the counter, while James was briefly in the back room with the signed agreement documents that Daniel had agreed to walk him through. He told it simply, without embellishment, the way he told most true things now. "He noticed," Daniel said. "He is the one who most takes after Caroline," Edward said. "He notices what I do not say." James came back from the back room and sat down and drank his coffee and talked to Daniel about the plaza timeline and the pharmacy anchor and the farmer's market structure with the easy directness of someone who knew the material and also knew the person across from him was not going to be satisfied with anything less than the honest version. At one point, he said, without transition, he came home different in December, after the agreement. My sister called me and said, something happened to Dad on Sycamore Lane. We didn't know what it was yet. We just knew something had shifted. Daniel looked at Edward. Edward was looking at his coffee, the expression of a man who knows he is being accurately described and has decided to let it happen. He called me the week after Christmas, James continued. We talked for an hour. We haven't talked for an hour since Mom died. He paused. He told me he had been sitting on a stool in a corner store for 6 weeks and had learned more about what a life was for than he had learned in the previous decade. He looked at his father. I told him that was embarrassing for both of us. Edward looked up. He did say that. It was true, James said. And then I said, all right. So what are we going to do about it? Daniel thought about a 14-year-old boy on the phone for 40 minutes, talking about what he was afraid of. About 3 children who had been taught the language of provision and were being offered, slowly and imperfectly, a different language by a father who was learning it late. What are you going to do about it? Daniel asked. James looked at his father. Edward looked at his son. Between them was something that had been a long time in the building and was not finished yet, but was no longer uncertain about whether it was worth building. Show up, James said. That's the whole plan. Show up and stay. Daniel looked at the photographs of his father above the register. He thought about bones, about what held up, about the specific and irreplaceable value of a person who was the same every day, who didn't have 2 versions, who kept the light on for anyone who needed it. He thought about Edward Marsh on a cold Thursday morning, hands shaking, sitting in his car for 20 minutes outside his cardiologist's office, driving to Sycamore Lane because there was a light on. He thought about everything a light on in a window means to someone who has been in the cold long enough. It was on a Saturday in late April that the thing happened, which completed the shape of everything, the way a last piece makes visible what the whole was always going to be. Daniel was alone in the store, early, before the Saturday rush, doing the produce check the way he always did it, going through the crates methodically when the bell above the door gave its sound. He looked up. A man came in. Mid-60s work clothes. He had a jacket with a name stitched on the chest pocket. He stood just inside the door the way Edward had stood on that first Thursday, holding the handle. Not quite decided, but where Edward's uncertainty had been about something internal, something he was working through in himself. This man's uncertainty was simpler and more immediate. He was cold. He was tired. And he did not know if this was the kind of place that was for him. Daniel had seen this before. He had seen it his whole life. He recognized it the way he recognized the flickering light in the bread aisle, as something that needed attending to, something that was telling him what it needed if he was willing to look. Come in, Daniel said. You're letting the cold in? The man released the door handle. It swung shut. He stood for a moment, looking at the store with the quick, calibrated assessment of someone taking inventory of an unfamiliar room. Then he looked at Daniel. Coffee on, he said. Always, Daniel said. He poured a cup. He set it on the counter without being asked and added the small ceramic pitcher of cream, because most people of that generation took cream, and Daniel had learned not to make people ask for ordinary things. The man sat on the stool. He wrapped both hands around the mug the way Edward had on that first Thursday morning. He drank slowly, not saying anything, and Daniel went back to the produce crates and gave him the space that the store had always given people who needed it. After a few minutes, the man said, This block's changing. It is, Daniel said. Lot of blocks changing. Yes. The man looked at the photographs above the register, and at the handwritten signs in the window, at the framed business license under its plastic wrap. This place been here a while, he said. It was not a question. 51 years, Daniel said. My grandfather's store, then my father's, now mine. The man turned the mug in his hands. He looked at the counter, at the worn wood of it, at the place near the edge where 51 years of arms had rested and left their mark, the kind of mark that was not damage but record. My grandfather had a hardware store, he said, 2 neighborhoods over. Used to take me there on Saturdays. He paused. It's a parking structure now. Daniel set down the produce he was holding. He looked at this man on the stool, at the jacket with the name on the chest, at the hands around the mug. When at the specific kind of tiredness in the eyes that came not just from one hard morning, but from years of watching things disappear that should have stayed. "Saturday's at a hardware store," Daniel said. "What did you do there?" The man looked at him. He hadn't expected the question. Not the deflection of it, not the politeness, but the genuine curiosity, the asking as though the answer mattered. He sat up a little straighter on the stool. "Sorted nail," he said, "by size. My grandfather said it was the most important job in the store because if the nails weren't sorted right, nothing else worked." "Was he right?" Daniel said. The man looked at the counter. Something moved across his face, the particular expression of a person remembering something they haven't thought about in a long time. It's something that had been stored somewhere safe and is now, unexpectedly, available again. He was right about most things, he said. Daniel thought about bones, about what held up, about the Saturday morning his own father had put him behind the register for the first time at 11 years old and said, "Everyone who comes through that door is somebody's whole world to someone. You remember that." He had remembered it. He had been remembering it every day for 23 years. He looked at the man on the stool, at the mug in his hands, at the warm light of the store around him. Outside on Sycamore Lane, the April morning was doing what April mornings did on old blocks, arriving with a particular quality of light that made everything look briefly the way it had always looked before everything started changing. Want the same light that had fallen on this storefront for 51 years, on Daniel's father and his father's customers, and the slow, faithful accumulation of people who had come through a door because there was a light on and someone inside who knew how to see them. The bell above the door had not changed in 51 years. It was a small brass thing on a crooked nail, and it made the same sound it had always made. Not a cheerful ring, not a bold chime, just a quiet, plain sound that said someone was here. It was enough. It had always been enough. Daniel Kowalski went back to his produce crates. The man on the stool drank his coffee. The bread aisle held its steady light, and the store did what it had always done, which was the same thing it would do tomorrow and the day after that. On and for as long as there was someone willing to keep the light on, which is the only thing in the end that any of it had ever asked. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.